Welcome to an Awarelogue special titled AFGHAN Views, where we look back. 6 months have passed by since the fall of Kabul, the withdrawal of the United States military, and several developments have been taking place in the South Asian country of Afghanistan. Joining us in our first of our series, AFGHAN Views, is Afghanistan's ambassador to Sri Lanka, His Excellency M. Ashraf Haidari. Thank you very much, Excellency, for taking time to join us to look back at what has happened, reflect on developments, the impact it has had on Afghanistan and its people, but also looking at the much wider reach. Where are we going? Are we making progress? Is there progress being made? What more has to be done? That's why we would like to focus on this particular session of AFGHAN Views. If you could start off by telling us the current situation on the ground in Afghanistan.
Well, thank you so much, George, for the opportunity to talk to you on your show. Again, I recall from our last interview when the unfortunately tragedy was unfolding. Afghans desperately trying to leave the Kabul airport, clinging on the plane, some of whom unfortunately fell and died. That situation, unfortunately, hasn't changed. If you just take a look at the recent images and video clips, you will see two types of lines of people. One line are those that unfortunately are really in acute need of any basic relief aid that they can get either from people locally or from international humanitarian aid agencies trying to barely make both ends meet and survive. And another line is of Afghan youth and any Afghans with any means to get out of the country simply because they cannot see life under the oppressive, suppressive, and brutal rule of the Taliban, who, since they took over power in Afghanistan last August, of course, illegally and forcefully against the United Nations Charter, especially Chapter 7, when it comes to the regional interference from state actors such as Pakistan that enabled the Taliban throughout their campaign, especially over the past 2 years that led up to the August 15th, when they were able to topple a developing democracy, a flourishing democracy, and took over. And since, of course, they failed to establish a representative and inclusive government, which is the demand of an absolute majority of the Afghan people, and as well as from the international community, which continues to sanction the Taliban. Half of the Taliban's de facto government are on the UN terror sanctions list, including the Minister of Interior, which is blacklisted by the United States FBI. So that's where things stand, unfortunately, with reports from UNDP, World Food Program, UNICEF, World Health Organization, reporting these grim statistics of how the quality of life is fallen, how Afghans are on the brink, and how some 22 million Afghans are in acute need of food, how 3 million Afghan children are suffering from acute malnutrition, and as well as another 9 million or so needing immediate assistance today because they're at the risk of a famine, as of course the situation brought about by the Taliban has been further compounded by the adverse effects of climate change, of course, chronic internal displacement, chronic poverty, which have been there, unfortunately. So that's where things stand at this time.
Excellency, we're hearing reports which are terming the situation in Afghanistan highly dangerous, volatile, risky. When you look at what the country is going through at the moment, would you say Afghanistan is worse off today than it has ever been in the past?
Afghanistan is a lot worse than it was in the past. In the past, we were just fighting the Taliban terror campaign, of course, deployed out of Pakistan. But right now, the Taliban have sheltered over a dozen regional and transnational terrorist groups. The UN just reported that the son of Osama bin Laden visited Afghanistan recently and had held meetings with the senior leadership of the Taliban. This is just Al-Qaeda, but also alongside Al-Qaeda, Daesh has emerged in Afghanistan, whether it is organic or inorganic, something as an alternative used by state actors such as Pakistan to threaten the Taliban, to keep them in check so that they're controlled as they have always invested in and expected to do so. But then also other regional separatist terrorist groups such as East Turkestan Islamic Movement, whose target is Western China and China, which the Taliban are sheltering in northeast of Afghanistan, and as well as Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, with members both from Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and Central Asia, which is quite concerned about the presence of IMU in northeast of Afghanistan along the borders of Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. That's why the Russian Federation, in support of both Uzbekistan and especially Tajikistan, which is more vulnerable, has deployed forces and, of course, beefed up security along the border with Afghanistan. So your, I think, description of a volatile of the situation in Afghanistan is correct. Well, of course, we don't see people dying from suicide terrorist attacks as much as there are still such attacks. ID attacks are ongoing, as well as targeted assassinations and forced disappearances, as you see, have been on the rise of especially journalists and activists, but a lot more Afghans are dying as a result of this man-made humanitarian crisis brought about by the Taliban.
Excellency, it is quite well known that de facto recognition was accorded to the Taliban a long time ago. I mean, in terms of the negotiations, discussions that were taking place long before the fall of Kabul. Have you seen that this has helped the people of Afghanistan in any way, in terms of engagement with the Taliban?
Absolutely not. Like I said, unfortunately, Afghanistan has already lost much of the brain that it had gotten over the past 20 years. Students who had come back from the rest of this region, South Asia, including even students from Sri Lanka. Just yesterday, I talked to one student who just graduated from a Sri Lankan university with a degree in water management. Imagine that as the key capacity which Afghanistan has long needed, and President Ghani was so grateful to Sri Lanka for providing some scholarships in this particular area of great need in Afghanistan. But unfortunately, this student yesterday told me that, Ambassador, I've just contacted the UNHCR office seeking asylum and hoping that I would be resettled simply because I cannot go back home. If I do, I would immediately be targeted, as yet, of course, gotten that scholarship to gain that education and go back and work with the Islamic Republic based on the constitutional order that we had in place, which he said, of course, no longer exists. And as a result, he, of course, doesn't agree with anything that the Taliban stands for. Massive brain drain has happened. Our youth, unfortunately, have been still escaping and fleeing Afghanistan, most of whom are stranded in countries like Pakistan, Iran, on the way to Turkey. In Turkey, there's a large number of Afghans hoping to make it to Europe. Unfortunately, most cases, as you know, they get on these boats, which often, unfortunately, sink and drown, having killed dozens of Afghans over the past months or so. And starvation, as we speak, is happening. The economy is collapsed. The banking sector doesn't exist. People who had some savings in the banks can no longer withdraw them. services across the country have discontinued. Remember last time we discussed how the Taliban had been running over any local state institution at the village, district, and provincial levels. Those are all gone, and as a result, I was just reading some statistics from WHO saying how the health clinics that used to be open and provide basic health care for adults, especially mothers with children under 5, and small babies have completely evaporated. And so that's the case with one hospital, I think, that treats COVID-19, and that's in Kabul, which this report says is almost lacks some 36 different types of basic medicines, let alone the gas for the generators to have electricity, or the oxygen and other sophisticated equipment to treat any COVID infected patients who visit this hospital in Kabul. We're just now talking about Kabul. That's a very dire humanitarian situation. Unfortunately, as the world, unfortunately, still maintains these general sanctions on Afghanistan, punishing the people of Afghanistan, but not specifically in a very smart way, targeting those in Afghanistan, including the Taliban leadership, and as well as those outside Afghanistan who have sponsored them over the past 20 years that have together, the two have brought about this humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. So they just go free while the people of Afghanistan get punished, which is completely unacceptable under international humanitarian and human rights laws.
Officially, we are yet to see countries recognizing the Taliban as being officially in charge of the country. What do you think needs to change for that to happen, Excellency? If we go back to the last time it happened, when Taliban was in control, they had at least 3 countries that officially recognized them within the region, within the wider region. What needs to change for that recognition to come on board?
Well, this time around, even those countries, including their principal patron and the sponsor, Pakistan, has not recognized them simply because Pakistan knows the implications from the international community. As a result, the whole international community encouraging, warning, conditioning aid, humanitarian aid, so that the Taliban would, reform, open up, and form an inclusive government acceptable to all Afghans. Much like Sri Lanka, Afghanistan is a multi-ethnic country, very diverse, which is one of our core strengths. But unfortunately, the Taliban de facto government completely consists of one ethnic group, that's Pashtun, and of course, all of it is male. Most of them are terrorists and sanctioned by the United Nations. That excludes women, and they have also not only excluded women, but also banned women from working, and as well as girls from secondary education. And I just read another statistics from UNDP, which estimates that this banning of women from working in Afghanistan is already costing Afghanistan over $1 billion. So for a country that is poor, that is, of course, hit by 2 decades of conflict, totally speaking, 4 decades of conflict, the adverse climates of effects of climate change, because Afghanistan is the most climate vulnerable country in South Asia, what itself is the most vulnerable a region to climate change. You can imagine how much just this banning of women from working in Afghanistan is costing Afghanistan's economy, with a direct impact on the overall health of the population. And that's why you have the severe case of malnutrition, which we've never seen in Afghanistan. Or you have hundreds of thousands of Afghans standing in lines to just get a loaf of bread to take home for usually extended families, because families are still big, fertility rate is still high in Afghanistan. Any young family has up to 4 or 5 kids. And then, of course, we're speaking 4 decades of war, then you have 1 or 2 widows that depend on you, and their kids that depend on you. And as a result, it's a very dire situation that unfortunately we don't hear much in the way that I just described.
Talks were held recently in Norway in terms of finding a way forward, trying to make progress. And there we saw humanitarian aid being tied to human rights. In your opinion, is this realistic and feasible?
Well, not really. I mean, because the Taliban is a terrorist group, maybe numbering around 100,000 have survived over the past 20 years. They are directly benefiting from Pakistan that is bankrolling them and, of course, providing them with safe haven whenever needed when they go back, across the Doran line, and as well as enabling them to continue this illicit drug business with cultivating massive amounts of opium poppy, as well as ephedra for these methamphetamine drugs that they're increasingly producing in Afghanistan and exporting, that the value of which total is over $2 billion or so. So the Taliban really couldn't care less. Yes, they're pushing this dire situation which they've brought about as a pressure on the international community to somehow, recognize them and to, of course, continue providing aid resources, which would, free the Taliban of the responsibility to feed a population which they have taken over forcefully and illegally. So it benefits them to continue going to these meetings and places like Oslo, which I really strongly opposed because it really didn't benefit the people of Afghanistan. It directly benefited the Taliban, the Taliban's propaganda machine, their campaign for recognition. But in terms of the returns, we saw that the Oslo meeting wasn't even able to free 2 female activists, which, of course, all the women activists who had been invited to attend the meeting demanded in each of the meetings and events of the 3 days of meetings that happened in Oslo. Unfortunately, the Norwegians ferried these sanctioned terrorists in a VIP plane from Kabul. Well, like as one of the women activists said, that they had to fill out applications to declare that they'd never, participated in any kind of illegal or terrorist or illicit business. Well, these terrorists got on this VIP plane and comfortably were taken to Oslo to attend the meeting. So it was counterproductive. It didn't help. It further emboldened the Taliban to disappear more of our journalists, advocates, and activists. And that's exactly what I predicted. And that's what exactly has happened since that meeting in Oslo. And that's why we, diplomats of the Islamic Republic, I as an Afghan, having known these issues that have happened over the past 20 years, discourage from happening in the future, and encouraging our partners, especially in the European Union countries like Norway, with a record which is questionable even when it comes to Sri Lanka, but at least as a so-called established democracy, to end these kinds of meetings with sanctioned terrorists against the people of Afghanistan.
Absolutely. Excellency, we saw hundreds fleeing Kabul. You made reference to it as well, exactly 6 months ago. Today, where are these people?
Well, a very small number of them have made it to countries with whose forces they served, or NGOs, or institutions that were operating in Afghanistan over the past 20 years. A large number of them remain in a limbo, needing basic records from their former employers, mostly contractors in Afghanistan, who made billions, unfortunately, but now they're not providing these basic recommendations, certifications for some of these, what they call special immigrant visa applicants, SIV applicants, who are stranded across Afghanistan, most of them in hiding, as many of them have been, found by the Taliban, picked and disappeared, whose families don't know, what has happened to them. And there's probably, a lot worse news than what I'm saying, simply because remember, our freest media in the region has been completely blacked out. There is no free media anymore in Afghanistan. So whatever news that we get is occasional reports from Western reporters that come and go, or clips, or bits and pieces of news that people put on social media if they can, and as well as whatever we hear from people in Afghanistan. So that is the situation. And also a large number of Afghans, like I said, are stranded in countries like Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, hoping to get out. I know of at least a few cases, even in Sri Lanka and Colombo, with a really good record of having worked with, for example, U.S. aid organizations or related NGOs, and they have all the recommendations and certifications, but they still have not been able to get a visa. And thanks to some Sri Lankan families who've been helping them, simply because I think they work with a similar organization that has chapters around the world, including in Sri Lanka. And so in that kind of solidarity, they're helping these few Afghans in Colombo. So they're living in a very uncertain situation. Even those who have made it to the United States, most of them are still in camps, still being processed out. And once they're out, there isn't any kind of social welfare system that exists in Europe or Australia or Canada. So in the US, there's very minimal assistance to help them stand on their feet. So that is also a challenge for these newly arrived immigrants with large families, mostly young. So that news is also not that good, but that's where things stand.
Society is crumbling. It's a deteriorating economic situation on the ground. Families are divided. So many remain displaced, not just within Afghanistan, but around the world. People who try to flee to save their lives, they left their families behind, who are facing the brunt of developments within the country. When you look at Afghanistan, Excellency, this is a country that you have represented, that you have done so very proudly. How hopeful are you of the future of a country which has amazing potential? How hopeful are you?
Well, the potential is amazing. There's one part that, of course, depends on the Afghan people, and especially the leadership and Afghans with any capacity and means in and out of Afghanistan, to really look at, the mistakes that they made over the past 20 years, not really, taking advantage of the opportunities that emerged in terms of international presence and resources to really build the state and institutions, deepen them such that when the Taliban or, another terrorist group in the future would attack and try to take over, that we could, repel them, defeat them, much like Sri Lanka did in case of LTTE. Imagine if your state had not been strong enough and lacked the leadership to really keep fighting and until decisive defeat. Then something similar situation would have happened in Sri Lanka as well, and hundreds of thousands of Sri Lankans, unfortunately, have and lost limbs, much like the case of Afghanistan. So that's that Afghan part that we need to get it right. We need to really work together, unite, come on the same page, and follow one solid leadership with vision, dedication, and commitment. And the other part is, of course, regional players, especially China, Russia, India, and Iran. They really need to look at what is in the best long-term interest, whether these terrorist networks running Afghanistan, which is right at the heart of Asia, key to any connectivity project that is very integral to their long-term national economic strategy, especially when it comes to China or even India. India's Central Asia Connect policy, Afghanistan is very relevant. Or if you look at Iran, of course, fearing this resurgence of extremist Sunni Taliban that could easily turn against it, and as well as Russia being very concerned about the resurgence of extremism in Central Asia. So it is in their shared best long-term interest to come together and help Afghans to form an inclusive government, so that the Taliban is just maybe one group among many other Afghans to truly form a government that will be accountable, responsible for providing for the Afghan people now and securing the future of Afghanistan, as well as ensuring that Afghanistan is a good neighbor around us to everyone and so forth. But also, our traditional partners over the past 20 years, if you look at NATO, is still concerned about the same issues that unfortunately have only grown worse in Afghanistan: terrorism, extremism, drug trafficking. Much of drugs that go out of Afghanistan, of course, even it goes to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is not only now increasingly consuming country of Afghan drugs, but also a transit that goes to Western Europe. That's the end market. And the net worth from, I think, Afghan drugs is, in tens of billions of dollars that directly fund crime across Western Europe. And if you look at the direct related public health cost, it's massive. And as well as, of course, the other spillover effects such as refugees, illegal migrants, about which Europeans are very concerned. And on the one hand, these humanitarian human rights and refugee obligations under the conventions. On the other hand, their politicians don't want any immigrants from countries like Afghanistan. So the only solution is to help stabilize Afghanistan and to help, the country stand on its own. And the only way to do that is to get Pakistan to discontinue supporting the Taliban, or now, they're increasingly looking into Daesh as an alternative down the road. So to fix that, matter of the problem in South Asia, which is Pakistan. And so that's why we are proposing small sanctions on any elements and institutions in our region that destabilize Afghanistan, but not to punish the people of Afghanistan who have already suffered. When that happens, I think that carrots and the sticks and incentives and disincentives based on a long-term strategy, and of course Afghans doing our part, then we could be hopeful. If that doesn't happen, which is very remote, unfortunately, given the conflicting interests, geopolitical, geostrategic, we see now so much attention being paid to Ukraine crisis, Afghanistan slowly being forgotten, then it's hard to be optimistic about the situation in Afghanistan, at least for the foreseeable future, 5 to 10 years.
Exactly. This is where, when we listen to the news or listen to reports coming out of the country, we hear assessments being done of the situation. It's people are the ones who are being affected. Whether there's a freeze on financial assets of the country, or humanitarian aid is being frozen or not forthcoming, it's people who are suffering, not administrations or purported administrations. It boils down to people. And that is why we wanted, through the Awarelogue Initiative, to highlight the fact that it is the plight of people that we've got to be concerned about. Human beings like you and I, who are going through terrible conditions on a daily basis. And this has been going on now for a long period of time. It will be 6 months since the fall of Kabul, since the takeover of the Taliban. The situation remains extremely sensitive 6 months later. We can only hope that the situation is going to improve in the next 6 months, because people are going through extremely harsh, risky, and terrible conditions on the ground. Thank you very much, Ambassador Haidari, for taking time to join us on the Awarelogue Initiative on this special series titled Afghan Views, where we're exploring different aspects of the country 6 months after the fall of Kabul. Thank you once again, Excellency, for your time, and thank you for joining us on this particular series.
Well, thank you so much, George, for continuing to pay attention to the situation in Afghanistan, especially your special focus on the people and their suffering, because they have suffered for now too long, 4 decades. And thank you for keeping focus and highlight on that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Most welcome. Thank you once again for joining us. Join us again in another episode of this series where we continue to listen to voices out of Afghanistan, look at what people are going through, what their plight is, and try to understand how Afghanistan fits into our bigger picture of South Asia and the role Afghanistan has to play on the world stage. Thank you once again.
Thank you.